So I wanted to welcome everybody who's joining us today. We're really excited to have our first Geothink and Learn on the topic of Pokémon Go and governance. And before we get started, I just wanted to go over a few of the guidelines for attendees who have joined us, just so that you know how to use in video once we get to our question and answer session. So in particular, there's 3 ways that you can ask a question during our question and answer session. The first is, as you may have seen in the document that I shared with you, is that you can raise your hand. So if you'd like to ask a question and you'd like to actually be visible to all of the audience and to have your audio recorded as a part of our webinar, if you hit the raise your hand button, I will actually see that on my end and I can promote you to being a panelist while you ask your question. The other ways you can ask your question is at the bottom of your screen. In the same place where you see that raise your hand button, you'll see 2 buttons. One that does Q&A. In the Q&A button, you can both write your questions for the panelists, as well as anonymously write your questions for the panelists. But keep in mind, when you're deciding how you want to ask your question, that we are recording this entire session and we may use it later on the Geothink site or elsewhere. And the final thing that you'll see on that bottom toolbar is a chat. So if for some reason you need to chat with anybody during the session, you can specify who you'd like to chat with and start a chat in that way. One note is that if you have dialed in from a telephone, you will actually not be able to actually do any of these options. So be aware that if you would like to ask questions in our Q&A session, that you should, at this point in time, take a moment and re-enter the webinar from your computer using the Zoom video conferencing tool. And if you're on a mobile device, please do just let me know. You can chat to me if you're having any issues with any of these aspects of it. So welcome again to our first Geothink and Learn. And I'd like to now introduce our first speaker and the convener of this session, Pamela Robinson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to join us today. I'm talking to you from downtown Toronto, where I'm a professor at Ryerson University in the School of Urban and Regional Planning. We're super excited that you've chosen to come and join us for our first Geothink and Learn today about augmented reality. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, our kind of working understanding of what augmented reality is that it's when you use computer technology to overlay a visual interface on top of the real world around you using a device, frequently a mobile phone. Renee, do you want to add anything to that definition, or is that sufficient for us to keep moving forward?
One of the revolutions with mobile devices is that they are geospatially aware. So content is being delivered to you, and in the case of augmented reality, overlaid on top of a screen because your camera lens is open because of where you are.
Great, thank you. So this collective group of people, we're a part of a team called Geothink&Ca, which is a research team assembled from 26 faculty members and 30 partners across Canada and numerous graduate students who've worked with us over the last 5 years. So we represent people from law, geography, planning, politics, and other disciplines. And our intention is to try to understand how the geospatial web is shaping citizen-government interactions. So we talked about, when we pitched this Geothink and Learn today, about augmented reality and governance, and the focus on governance is really about the relationships between government and the private sector and government and the public and other levels of government. So without further ado, I'm going to start talking about some work that my students did from the School of Urban and Regional Planning last fall with the City of Toronto as our partner. And one of the things that we looked at over the course of the work that our students did was we tried to understand how Pokémon Go as a specific augmented reality tool may or may not help the City of Toronto work with its citizens better to make decisions and to do public consultation and public engagement work. And so one of the things that the students did was they did a deep dive into how the tool worked. They did all kinds of geospatial analysis in terms of trying to understand how people use the tool and where they use the tool. They had to engage in some creative data procurement to try to get the information that they needed to be able to access where the Pokemon stops and gyms were, for example. Those are elements of the game and how people played it. But in the end, the most interesting thing that came out of the research that the students did was they developed this tool called an evaluative framework for new technology. And the focus of this tool was to try to help government staff understand what to do when new technology comes along. And this became a really important theme in their research, in part because city government staff are bound by all kinds of rules and regulations. Sometimes they can't even access technology at their desk, even though they may possess it on their personal phone. But there are also procurement rules that they have to follow. And there are additional encumbrances that involve the ethics of tool use. And so when new technology emerges, they need some help in terms of trying to figure out what to do. And so the students identified a whole series of considerations for municipal government staff to think about. And those are the circles around the question, is this a useful tool for city staff? So they examined the functionality of the tool. They tried to understand what were the sources of the data. They tried to understand the communication techniques, whether or not the tool was inclusive, what liability issues may arise, what political implications may come up, and what consultation and engagement pieces may emerge. And I'm just going to focus on a few key things that city staff could use to evaluate these tools, which informs the last circle in the graphic that the students made. The biggest challenge that our students found around the use of a tool like Pokémon Go is the issue of inclusivity. To be able to use the tool, you need to have a mobile device, and you need to have access to continuous data. And so one of the things that the students were concerned about was that if the City of Toronto or any other municipal staff wanted to use an augmented reality tool like Pokémon Go to start to engage people in city decision making, one of the questions they asked themselves was, who are the users using this tool? How are they accessing the tool online? And most importantly, who's missing? Because municipal government staff have an obligation to make sure that their public consultation processes are accountable, that they're able to understand who participated, but also who wasn't there, and who they would have to go and find and reach through other techniques. And so one of the things that was flagged with this particular tool is that it's very data intensive in its use. With cities having things like free public Wi-Fi, like the City of New York is offering and City of Montreal has downtown and Toronto's experimenting with in some zones, you could have free connectivity in some places, but not universally across the city. And so that lack of continuous free public Wi-Fi access means that you're going to get sporadic input, but also that you're not going to have geographically universal disbursement of people using the tool across the city. So that was an important thing important issue for people to think about. Another issue that arose when the students were looking at Pokémon Go as a particular tool was the issue of liability. And Tennille's going to talk about legal implications a little bit later on in our webinar, but one of the big things that came up with the use of Pokémon Go was the issue of trespass. And were people going on land that wasn't public in pursuit of capturing the kinds of things they wanted to gain points for inside the game? And so city governments have to be careful in a different way than other users and promoters of this kind of tool are, because they can't incite trespass through the use of tools, but also they want to make sure that they're not exposing people to harm. We heard stories when Pokémon Go was at its peak about people walking into lakes or going into places that they shouldn't have been and getting hurt. Those are concerns, but also concerns of trespass are important. The political implications of the tool are also interesting, and this is the last point that I'll really focus on before I pass the mic on to someone else. The political implications are interesting because a city can send a bunch of messages when it chooses to embrace a tool like Pokémon Go or other augmented reality tools. They could send a signal that they're very progressive and they're engaging youth, which are typically a hard group of people to be able to reach through these kinds of tools. But also, if they put all of their public engagement eggs in a basket like Pokémon Go and something goes wrong, they're assuming new risk in terms of political trust being broken that they often don't have the license to be able to do. And so when governments are risk averse around the use of new technologies, often it's because the public isn't particularly patient with the kinds of things that come out when things don't go as smoothly as planned. And with emergent technology, we all know that we can expect that there'll be bumps along the way, but city staff don't have the luxury of making the same kinds of mistakes that we all do in our civilian lives. I'll conclude my little bit by saying that there are two applications of this kind of augmented reality tool that our students found to be the most promising for the city. One relates to land use planning and development. These kinds of tools can be particularly helpful when the city wants to seek public input on a particular site being developed. So should a building go in a particular place? Through augmented reality, the city could be able to solicit very specific input by showing people what the development would look like. The other piece is public education, particularly around ecological and cultural issues. One of the things our students projected that augmented reality would be useful for was for city staff to be able to help people see the history and the culture of the places that they're visiting without having to go and look at a website, because the push function on the augmented reality tools would let these kinds of images pop up on their phone as people were going about their everyday life. So, to conclude, the students found that new technology presents both opportunities and challenges, and this evaluative framework that they've developed is a good working tool for municipal staff, but that the opportunities mostly relate for cities right now, as we understand augmented reality, to be focusing on public consultation and engagement about site-specific issues, and also public education around cultural and ecological issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And one thing I wanted to mention is that you can feel free to write your questions now, but the speakers will be handling all of the questions asked at the end of all the presentations. And our next presentation will be from Adriana de Souza y Silva.
Right. Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen here. Let me know if it's working. All right. Okay. So this is me taking a detour from picking up my daughter at daycare to catch some balls at the Pokestop at the park that's close to our house. And there's another Pokestop at the gas station nearby that I always hate when I'm filling up the tank. And Pokemon Go, as you all know, became famous, among other reasons, for requiring people to move around in order to play the game. But what I'm going to briefly say in this presentation is that this is not new. So in 2001, the Swedish company It's Alive launched what they named the world's first location-based mobile game called Bot Fighters. Unlike the augmented reality setup for Pokemon Go, Bot Fighters version 1 was played exclusively with text messages. So as you can see from these images, your phone can scan other players nearby and allow you to virtually shoot them depending on the actual distance from other players. And there are actually accounts from popular press sources that tell us Bot Fighters players would drive to unknown parts of the city just to engage with battles with other players. Similarly, Mogi in Japan motivated players to move differently across the city. Mogi was a treasure hunt-like game in which players had to collect location-based digital pictures as shown on the screen. In his ethnographic study of Mogi, Christian Leacock tells us that players would choose to take the bus instead of the subway, for example, so that they could catch some creatures while commuting to work, or that they would get together with other players to go to a specific park at night because there were like creatures at that specific location. All these games, they also overlaid ludic game spaces on top of the actual city space, which was done most prominently by Blast Theory, Can You See Me Now? In this game / media art piece, players were kind of running on the city streets to catch online players who ran on a digital model of the same city. These are not the only examples of hybrid reality and location-based mobile games. There's just a few to show that in the last 15 years or so, several of these games have been created. They all had different audiences, different locations, different narratives, but all of them had one thing in common, which are they were very small scale. They were developed either as media art experiments or by startup companies or in educational settings. That means that the number of people actually playing the game very, very restricted. So as I showed with Bot Fighters and Mogi, they would influence or change how people move through the city, as they would also create different perceptions of space. So for example, which physical spaces were kind of overlaid or merged with digital space. And they would also allow people to connect to each other based on their relative position on space, a phenomenon that Christian Leacock called on-screen encounter, as you can see from the on this slide. And because they are of the social, spatial, and mobile characteristics of that kind of permeate all these games, they would connect play with ordinary life activities. For example, a passerby could easily be approached in Uncle Royal Around You from Blast Theory player to ask for directions. And similarly, cooperation was also an essential part of these games. People could collaborate either on, for example, as I mentioned in Moji, going on an expedition to find creatures on parks, or collaborating to catch an online player, as in Can You See Me Now on the picture at the right. And finally, these games are also based on the premise of mutual surveillance. Surveillance could happen either via like an online player that was constantly monitoring a street player, like in the case of Uncle Royal Around You, or via collateral surveillance, like in Moji, where players could see each other's location on the screen and sometimes actually pinpoint other players on the city streets. So I think as it's obvious at this point, I mean, Pokemon Go includes many of the characteristics of this older preliminary location-based mobile games, but also miss a few. So in Pokemon Go, players, they need to be moving around in order to catch Pokemon and go to Pokestops and gyms. So this is kind of the mobility aspect of the games that also belong to these other location-based mobile games. In terms of spatiality, physical and digital spaces are also overlaid in the augmented reality feature. And I may say Pokemon Go is the first kind of these games that actually connected effectively location-based and augmented reality experiences. That is, that you can actually see the digital Pokemon on specific locations, because the other games, they were just a digital representation of these things. And now with raids, players can actually collaborate with each other in order to defeat Pokemon. And what's more interesting, players obviously, they need to be physically close to each other in order to engage on a raid, right? But I think another aspect of these games was actually the ability to change the play space. So for example, Ingress, features, which was actually developed by the same company as Pokemon Go, and Pokemon Go, we have a lot of the same user and database from Ingress, but Ingress players could create portals, and therefore they could add information to the game space, a feature that's still not available to Pokemon players. Pokemon players, I mean, you cannot create Pokestops or gyms or even new Pokemon for that reason. And in terms of collaboration, and I mean, you have the raids, but you still don't have what Leikop said, the on-screen counter, in that sense that you're normally alone on your screen, right? You can see people normally pinpoint other players by looking at their phone around you, but the play space itself is still a solitary space. And I just would like to close up with some ideas and think of how, you know, I think we need to think, both look to the past, how Pokemon Go kind of follows a trend of this history of location-based and hybrid reality games that actually help people to move differently through space, to experience space in different ways, to collaborate with people and to survey other people in public spaces, but also look to the future and think that Pokemon Go was actually the first game to be what I call a massively player game. None of these other games actually the user base of Pokemon, and I think this has a lot of implications for how data is being collected about players, about where we go, location-based specific data, and so what are the implications for what location-based games are and how they're going to be developed in the future. Something we can maybe talk about later. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Adriana. And our next speaker will be Neil Brown.
Hi, my name is Neil. I'm at the University of Ottawa. I'm a PhD candidate here in the Faculty of Law, and I teach in the faculty also. I'm going to be talking to you today about property law and augmented reality. And I want to talk about two papers that are forthcoming, and they're written with Professor Elizabeth Judge, who's also at the Faculty of Law here, and she works in intellectual property, but she couldn't be with us today. And so the two titles of the paper are, firstly, Poke Memorials, Placing Norms in Augmented Reality, and a second one, which is going to be the substance of my talk, is called Code as Trespass and Code as Nuisance. And so my research is about property law, meaning real property, buildings, physical places in the city. And so some of the questions that came out in relation to the game when it was being played last summer is, as Adriana just spoke about, the physicality of it. People were walking all over the city playing the game. And so perhaps predictably, there were some lawsuits filed in relation to Pokémon Go. And there are lawsuits based on property laws. They're not talking about privacy, they're not talking about surveillance, and they're not talking about intellectual property. And so the lawsuits are in the US. There are 3 lawsuits in Michigan, New Jersey, and Florida. And also a lawsuit in Canada, in the province of Alberta. And they're all ongoing. And so they're class action lawsuits. I've just put a picture up there of the filings for the case. And so they're really interesting. They're ongoing. They're very unsettled at the moment. The current status of the US case is that it's on pause because we can't figure out exactly who the class members are, so who the property owners are from the court. But I want to tell you a little bit about the basis of what they're arguing. So the first case that was filed was New Jersey, and these 3 cases are now together. So the first one was New Jersey, and the private property owners in New Jersey complained that the Niantic, who is the company behind Pokémon Go, designated GPS coordinates on or near their properties without permission. So that's the first complaint. And then they say, secondly, that this constitutes a nuisance or a trespass. So that's the point that Pamela just made a moment ago, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. And thirdly, they said that this constitutes unjust enrichment, that here's a company that's making money off someone's private property. Now, that third point has been let go. They've dropped that part of the suit. So what we're talking about right now is the GPS coordinates and nuisance and trespass. And so the essence of the case is simply this question that I put on the slide here, whether defendants' conduct constitutes a trespass or a nuisance at common law, and if so, what remedies are available by law. So claiming trespass and nuisance is significant because it is property law, meaning the physical building. Trespass, the definition of trespass is to enter the owner's land or property without permission. So that's the physical going over the edges of the boundary of the property. Nuisance, the definition of nuisance is an unlawful interference with the use and enjoyment of a person's land. So nuisance, we don't actually need to step across the boundaries, but you can still interfere with someone's use of their properties. And from the perspective of property law, the part that the property owners are claiming that is new is this point of the GPS coordinates. And so this quote that I've put on the slide here is written in all of the case filings. And it says this: so within days of the game's release, it became clear that a number of the GPS coordinates that the defendants had designated as Pokestops and Pokemon gyms were in fact on or near private properties. And that defendants had placed these Pokestops and Pokegyms without the consent of the property's owners. So what's new there is the GPS. The GPS coordinates, can they constitute trespass? Are they part of the property's boundaries? That's what the property owners would have us. They would want to have the GPS coordinates included within the boundaries of their private properties. Is it possible to interfere with one's GPS coordinates that happen to be attached to your house to the extent that you would have nuisance? And so effectively what they're arguing is, can a virtual area be included as part of the property? Now, in terms of the case is ongoing, so it has not been concluded. We do not have the answer for that. In our paper, we suggest that there is not a strong case for GPS coordinates to be included within private property, therefore not a strong case for trespass or nuisance, which Pamela already alluded to. There are difficulties with measuring the GPS coordinates as being part of a private property. There is also questions about GPS coordinates as a public resource. So can we in fact take that, put it as part of our personal house? Lastly, there are other shortcomings, but the last one that I want to mention is for nuisance, you must show damages. So some of the questions that arise are, how can we show damages when someone's playing a game on their personal device? How does that affect us? And it's not to say that there are not strong claims in trespass and nuisance. A lot of the issues complained about would be caught by these common law torts. But there, just to finish up, I just want to touch this other part of the game. The lawsuits concern private properties, and so that's what the common law torts are designed for. But in addition, we saw last summer, and perhaps we see this summer still, that the Pokemon game is played in all sorts of public places, or what we would call in law sometimes public facing private properties. So these could be parks, streets, shopping centres, areas of significance, cemeteries, foyers in apartment buildings. And so I just have a few of the pictures which are the game being played in these places. So in terms of regulating these places through property laws, we might still have trespass that we could rely on, but also there are public law processes of zoning that we ought to think about. There are public law processes of bylaws that could give hours of operation for the game that we could think about. There's a whole new set of issues in relation to public spaces as well. So I'll just leave it there. I welcome any questions on all of these. It was a very brief overview of some of the legal activities that are ongoing. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Tennille. And our next speaker will be Renee Sieber. Renee?
Can you see the correct screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about race, class, and geography. I'm from McGill University, and I'm the principal investigator of Geothink. So this is Squirtle. Squirtle is a water monster, and part of the point of this slide is that the Pokemon Go creators deliberately decided to position the monsters according to their characteristics. So Squirtle presumably appears near water features. So I want to talk briefly about the goals of Pokemon Go, which can be found in John Hankey's first endeavor, which was called Field Trip. So John Hankey was a co-founder of a company called Keyhole, and Keyhole was bought by Google to create Google Earth, which was then merged to become Google Maps. He became the vice president at Google after the acquisition, and he subsequently led an augmented reality game spinoff called Niantic, of which Ingress, as Adriana de Souza Silva mentioned, and later Pokemon Go. It's important to realize that over and above a monetary objective of Google, John Hanke really had a normative agenda. He wanted people to go out and explore and discover and enjoy the physical world. And he also wanted to explore games that could only be done on mobile phones, as I mentioned earlier, on geospatially aware devices. So it was both the monetary goal, the fact that you could exploit a very different kind of technology, and a philosophical goal as well to deepen people's connections to the world. That's a very laudatory goal, and we might talk about sometimes destructive elements of Pokemon Go, but it's important to know that there were some underlying goals to help governance, to help people to connect with the physical world. That doesn't mean it's without its problems. Pokemon Go does assume that everyone is more or less the same, that you can walk and stop with impunity. And there was an important article in Medium that was written last year that was quite blunt. It said, warning, Pokemon Go is a death sentence if you are a black man. And the article starts with, I spent less than 20 minutes outside. 5 of those minutes were spent enjoying the game. 1 of those minutes I spent trying to look as pleasant and non-threatening as possible as I walked past a somewhat visibly disturbed white woman on her way to the bus stop. And the author points out that there are dangers and vulnerabilities if you walk in certain places and if you stop and do what others might consider suspicious things. So this laudatory goal that Pokemon Go and augmented reality can help you better connect with the world isn't equal across race, class, and gender. And the author points out that there's a statistically disproportionate chance that he would be that someone would call a police officer on him, that he would be approached aggressively by a law enforcement officer, that he might be shot while reaching for his identification, and that he might be shot multiple times. So it is sanguine for us to be aware of these potential problems as we try to design tools that employ augmented reality to provide more information on the landscape. There is, Tennille mentioned the problem of trespass on private property. Because Pokemon Go characters can be anywhere and linked to particular places based on characteristics, and follow John Hanke's goal of allowing you to explore places that you might not have seen, including areas that you might be slightly uncomfortable with. They create a kind of a poverty tourism or a slum tourism where you go to places where there might be collections of homeless people, or places where there are housing projects, and people might not want you to be there. There was a lot of activity in Montreal around an area called Dorchester Square, where a lot of Indigenous homeless people tended to congregate. And while they enjoyed the cookies and milk that was being put out by the local church that was a Pokestop, they weren't that comfortable when hundreds of people on occasion would descend in the early evening on what they considered their home. So it's important to remember that. One of the other things that happened was essentially a gamification of the sacred. It became quite notorious that Pokemon was being placed at cemeteries and being placed at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park and the Holocaust Museum. This is, I believe, Kofi, the Koofing the poison gas Pokemon at the Holocaust Museum. Why? Because John Hankey and his programmers thought, well, here's a place that's related to this feature, and we just happen to have a character that's attached to that. And it's also part of the automation of these kinds of games where you make these feature-to-feature attachments without any sort of human sensitivity of what you might be doing. So it's important to realize that there are those kinds of challenges when you create an augmented reality and when it becomes mission critical to your governance activity. And lastly, I just want to talk about, though, it's important to realize that as we create these tools to understand place, we are essentially creating a customized view of place. So with the increasing use of machine learning and other algorithms to customize our experience, you see that every day when you go to Facebook or you go to Google search. You literally are not seeing the same searches, you're not seeing the same news feeds that others are. It is in Google's and Facebook's best interest to customize, because when they customize, you click on more things, you go to more sites. So you literally have a unique experience when you use these tools. So we can easily create tools that, rather than creating a collective experience, because walking through a city is one place when you meet people not like you, and you're all seeing more or less the same thing. Now, obviously, this isn't the case because we have our own normal filters that choose to see some things, not other things. Increasingly, we see through these various technological lenses that allow us to literally highlight things that other people do, that other people aren't having highlighted. We get coupons because these are locationally aware devices for things that we can afford that other people, oh, you know, you can't afford Gucci, so we're not going to send you a Gucci coupon or an invitation to visit our Gucci store. So you get excluded from those, and we might enter near future in which these devices can literally erase place. So if we're walking with our camera lens always open, then we could put up pretty buildings where we want them, and for others, we just erase the space. We show an empty lot. So it is important to realize that with these devices, your geography may be your geography alone and not others. So we have to be sensitive to create devices that create collective experience. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Renee. And last but not least, our final speaker is Nick Seaver.
All right, let's see if I get this set up. Continue. And all right, are we good? Are we good?
That looks great.
All right, so hi, I'm Nick Seaver. I'm an anthropologist. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Tufts University. And I wanted to thank you for having me on here. I apologize if I'm a little bit bewildering sounding. I'm on week 2 of a parental leave, and so if you want to read a syntactically and semantically more coherent version of what I'm about to say, you can Google the name of this talk and find a blog post that's going to talk a little bit about that. But I hope this will be a little bit interesting for you. So I'm an anthropologist. In my normal work, I study how people who make algorithmic recommender systems for music think about the work that they do. They think about culture, music, taste, and so on. So those are systems like Spotify, Pandora, or Rdio like this. And one of the things that struck me when I was talking to folks who design these algorithmic systems is that they often talk about what they're doing in terms of capturing things. So they'll say they want to capture user attention, they want to capture market share, they want to enclose people, surround them with music, or they want to get them hooked on a service using the design of their algorithms. So while I was writing this research up, two things happened. One was that Pokemon Go came out and I started to play it. And the second was that I started reading a lot in the anthropology of traps and trapping. And that is a picture of Papua New Guinea eel trap. You can see an eel goes in one end and this catch goes up once they hit the back. So what I want to tell you in my short little time I have right now is to try to convince you that these three things have something to do with each other and that they're a little bit interesting, just to throw some ideas out. This will be a little bit out of left field, I think, compared to what we've had so far, but bear with me. So let's just start at the beginning. Step one, the Pokeball. So the basic operation in the game of Pokemon, any of the games, is gotta catch them all to capture Pokemon. But within the world of but within the world of the Pokemon games, what exactly a Pokeball does is a little bit vague and weird, right? It's on the one hand a kind of informatic capture. You enter the Pokemon you capture into a ledger, into this Pokedex, but on the other hand, you sort of physically capture them in a way that's vague. And if you look online, you can find a lot of fan art about what exactly is going on inside of a Pokeball within the game world. This is a picture of one of the less pleasant versions. But there's clearly some sense in which you're supposedly materially capturing these Pokemon so that you can have them fight each other. Now, this is obviously within the world of the game, but it brings us, I think, to the first interesting lesson from the anthropology of traps, which is that traps are material and semiotic, which is to say that when you're capturing something in general, you're not just physically capturing. You might think of like a mousetrap or something like that as just blunt physical destruction. But you're also, whenever you're using any kind of trap, operating within sort of broader signifying and knowledge system. So a mousetrap is based on some knowledge about how a mouse works, what mice like. That Papuan eel trap has a different set of ideas. It's placed in a different set of knowledge practices local to it. And they matter for how those things come to work. There's a lot more to say there, but I'll spare you. So traps, material, and semiotic. So that is not the only thing to say about traps. We also have, So look for instance at the Pokeball, which itself is this trap. This is not just about the Pokemon themselves who get sort of crammed in the middle, regardless of whether they're an enormous Snorlax or a little tiny Weedle, but it's also shaped for you. It's also designed for your hand. So in general, traps are models of not only the prey that they're trying to capture, but also the hunter that's trying to trap them. And you can see this in the eel trap. The trap is sort of the inverse shape of an eel, right? It's a tube, but it's also got the human on top of it. It's got this kind of fishing line structure. Okay, so now let's zoom out a notch to what's probably a little more interesting because it happens in the quote unquote real world, which is the game itself. And this brings us to sort of trap lesson number 2. Like I just said, traps are interfaces. They model hunter and prey. They're sort of a material semiotic way for two different kinds of entities to interact with each other, not just in one direction, but actually back and forth. And this is one of the sort of counterintuitive findings of the anthropology of traps. So when you're catching an eel, for instance, you are not only catching the eel is also catching you in a variety of ways, which I can't get into in the context of eels, but in the context of Pokemon, it's pretty clear. What's being caught are not only the Pokemon themselves, but also you. Your attention is being caught by the game, and that's on purpose, right? That's by design. And people have talked already about some of the ways that people get caught up in some of these broader systems. So when I talked to my algorithmic recommendation designer informants, they talked, like I said, about getting people hooked on their services, and they talked sometimes about a book which is this called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, which is part of a sort of big set of business advice books that use behaviorism, like Skinner box kind of stuff, to talk about product design, to talk about how you could make a system like Instagram, for instance, become a kind of attentional trap for its users, to take the users and to draw their attention in. So the kind of model that's built into, say, Instagram of you is a model that's informed by behaviorism. It's a model that's informed by A/B testing and all sorts of weird local theories about what people are like. Whereas the model to catch, say, an eel draws on another set of models and ideas. So The eel, for instance, has this idea built into it. You won't be able to understand this too much out of context, but in this system is built in this trap is built an idea about what eels are like, right? How eels tend to behave. One of the lines we have in the anthropology of traps is that traps are kind of texts on animal behavior. We know that eels swim like this. We know that if we put a little frog at the end of this trap, an eel will probably come in to try to eat it. And if we're wrong, an eel probably won't come in. We probably won't catch one, and we will change the trap accordingly. Okay, so this is not only true at the far end of apparent rudimentary technology like eel traps, but also in a sort of more contemporary end. This is Natasha Schull's book, Addiction by Design, which is a great book about the design of slot machines and how slot machines and random number generators in general are designed in order to capture user attention. So a distinctive feature of the Pokemon games is that they use random number generators in order to capture people's attention. And we know this from behaviorist research that animals in general go nuts when they get presented with the results of random number generators. We love to see what's going to pop out of systems that appear to be random. So this is a way to think about the modeling of humans. So the last kind of capture is this, which were some stories that came out right around when Pokemon was getting big, which was of people getting robbed or trapped in other ways in the physical locations where they were by people who had set lures or hung out near sort of isolated Pokemon gyms in order to capture people. So this gets us to our last sort of weird feature of the game, which was when it was out and popular. You could see scenes like this, right? Like groups of people. There was one next to my house here where people would just be like out in the park all day long. And you can see in here one of the interesting features of AR, which is that AR is not just a sort of layering of a sort of computer-generated graphics on top of the real world, but it's also about the sort of chaining together of different contexts, right? If you look at these people, you can sort of see what they're doing at one level, you can't see what they're doing at another level, and there's levels sort of deeper and higher up that are also hard to see and are sort of part of the augmentation of reality in a given moment. So that brings us to the final lesson of Traps 3, which is that traps are always sort of chained together. The trapper is always trapped, usually in some sort of broader context, right? So the Pokemon get drawn in by these lures, potentially. If you are interested in capturing Pokemon by getting them with a lure, you are going to get caught into a system where you can pay money to buy more lures. So the developers of the game make money off of you. You're going to get drawn to certain places in public where you might be caught up by robbers or people who want to do something bad to you, or as we heard earlier, into other sort of socioeconomic conditions, right? You might get caught in a situation in public space inflected by race and class. And so that brings us to the sort of final point here, which is that this chaining effect is often a sort of cascade, right? You've got in the middle, you've got, even in a real animal trap, you've got an animal who thinks they're going to capture something, say like a eel who thinks it's going to capture a frog, who's actually getting captured by a human, who's actually getting captured by a sort of higher order set of ideas about the way the world works. So I'll just leave it at that, and we can talk about why this matters at all in Q&A if people found it interesting. But thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Nick, for joining us. And thank you to all of our speakers for their wonderful presentations. So now I'd like to open up the session for Q&A. We have about 15 minutes left in our webinar. I just want to remind all of our attendees that if you'd like to ask a question, down at the bottom of your screen on that toolbar, you'll see two important buttons. One is a Q&A tab. That'll bring up a written way to ask questions, either anonymously or with your name that you entered upon joining the webinar. The other way is you can raise your hand, and I will be pinged on my screen to see that you've raised your hand, and I will promote you to be able to share your video and audio and ask our speakers your question directly. So to start us off, I think I'll ask a question to get our session started. And in particular, the question I want to ask is, we've heard a lot of very interesting analysis of Pokemon Go. But what I want to ask each of our speakers is, isn't Pokemon Go just a game? I mean, or are we taking it a little too seriously? Or is there some serious implications from this, even though it is just a game. So whoever might like to start us off.
When I was on CBC Radio last year, there was a lot of pushback after the interview where people were asking, isn't it oh my God, another academic, you're taking it too seriously. It is just a game. And that was also in part against the race and class dynamic that, come on, there can't possibly be those particular dimensions. But that often comes from a very privileged standpoint. You can more easily move in space and time, and you have the luxury of that movement in space and time. So it's more than a game. A question I'd have for Pamela would be, is it good for governance?
Well, I think, it's interesting. Nick, your presentation positioning the relationship between people as the hunter and the prey. If you think about local government using these kinds of tools, them thinking about their citizens as prey, you've really upended in a really important way, I think, the way we think about the use of new technology. I think whether it's a game or not, one of the things we're seeing with the digitization of government is that the lines in people's own minds between what government does and what the private sector do are getting blurry. And so we're expecting, for example, government to be as responsive as Amazon. And so, the game part, yeah, it could be perceived as silly and fun, but I think its introduction as a widely used and popular tool raises really important questions for government, because citizens are going to expect government to have a response. And so, game or not, it was popular. And I think government has to start paying attention to more popular technology trends, in part because its citizens are going to expect government to do that.
No, I just wanted to add that I think this is an interesting question because, Pokemon is definitely a game, but the problem is saying it's just a game, because that question implies that there's a separation between game and real life. And I think my point was that things that I always been trying to say when we study hybrid reality and location-based games is that these games, they kind of merge play and ordinary life, right? And in a sense, like regular games, even video games always did that. The idea that the magic circle is something that it's not permeable and separates, and you have this sphere of the game and the sphere of life, that doesn't exist. Even if you play a massively multiplayer game, these borders are very soft and permeable. But I think with location-based games and augmented reality games, they're even more connected. And the issue is that, every time that if you're kind of playing the game, you're basically transforming ordinary life spaces into ludic spaces and vice versa. So you're kind of seeing familiar spaces with unfamiliar eyes. And that kind of raises all kinds of questions that, first of all, it changes how we understand space, as Renee was talking in her talk. And I'm also, there's a chapter in my book, The Mobile Interface in Public Spaces, exactly thinking how places, there's this idea of differential spaces always existed, but when we add a layer of kind of embedding digital information in public spaces, that's augmented, right? And we have to think what are the how socioeconomic differences are gonna play a role in it when some people are gonna have access to information and some others don't. What are the kinds of access that are exacerbated? And lastly, how they can change mobility also in the city, right? As I am not only like trivially going and taking a different path to work, but also understanding how to move differently, right? And how digital information can change how we interact with public spaces.
Just to sort of follow up on Adriana's point, I think that one of the useful things about a game like this is that it makes some of these dynamics that happen in non-game contexts very evident, right? So we've got this idea of the magic circle or whatever, and that there's, this separation of the game world from the real world. And I think that what's interesting in this sort of traps frame is that these interfaces are exactly the kinds of places where capture happens, right? So the eel thinks it's playing a different game than the hunter thinks that they're playing, right? And it's not that to say those are isolated from each other. Clearly they interact, but what you see in the context of something like an AR game is that the options aren't like a real world or a separated world where there's a magic circle and everything else, or an AR world where there's like a real world and a fake world layered on top of it. But you have this kind of manifold adjacency thing happening where there's a variety of different kinds of trapping happening at different interfaces. And what's happening at those interfaces are changes in the idea about, and ideas about what the rules of the game are or what the terms of interest are, right? So I wasn't thinking about being robbed while I was thinking about picking up a Pokemon, or I wasn't thinking about, nuisance law while I was walking onto that person's front yard. And so I think that the game's really useful for thinking about that kind of thing, for making these things that exist in non-game contexts obvious. So it's not interesting because of Pokemon for their own sake.
Great. Oh, I'm sorry.
Can I just add something to that, just to provide like an anecdote? And I was thinking a lot about this, what Adriana was saying, just that there is no distinction to be made between real and virtual. And just an example from the case filings for the ongoing US litigation, one of the, and I can't recall which state it was right now, I think it may be in Florida, but in the case, the property owners described this incident that occurred. They have a private street in front of their housing complex. So it is a street, but it's not a public space, it's private. And it was infiltrated with many users playing the game. The property owners were very alarmed by this, and they felt scared because of all of the people that were coming into their space. And they made some complaints to Niantic and put some signs up asking people to leave. And there were multiple incidents of nuisance and trespass and minor criminal acts taking place. And it accumulated in the gamers organizing a protest against the property owners through Facebook. And the property owners leaving their house for the night because they were scared, right? And so I think when you say it's just a game, actually that incident's quite a serious incident, right? It's a whole disintegration between these online processes of Facebook and social media connected with these augmented realities and these people's private spaces. So I think that is a great example. That incident is a great example of why we should be thinking about these things.
So we have one question from one of our attendees who I'm going to promote to be a panelist now. This question comes from Victoria Fast, whose screen should now be shared. Victoria, if you want to speak.
It's muted.
Oh, let me just unmute Victoria. Sorry about that, Victoria. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
All right, I am unmuted, great. Well, thank you so much for organizing this. This was really fascinating. And so my question is around the data in particular. It's one thing we didn't talk about. You know, there's some rumblings about where the data came from and where they're putting the Pokestops and sacred places. But my concern is what data are they gathering on users? Who has access to that information? And then it's out there. Can we use it? And what can we use it for?
That's similar to a question that Majid just asked, which is how can this game be used for analyzing geolocation data, and what are the uses? Now, obviously, the uses in something like Pokemon Go are constrained by where the Pokestops are and where the Pokemon are. So it doesn't give you a good idea necessarily of how people use space. You could use augmented reality games or augmented reality in governance to just say, share a picture of a place that you love, or share a picture of your favorite urban furniture. Oh, I love this park bench, or I love this bus stop. So that could be a way to get a sense of where people like to go in space. You can also track with time and location stamps how people are moving in space. So it's not just where they stop, but also where they're going from an origin to a destination. And I note that Majid added that they could be used in hazard management applications as well. So you could actually use this in trying to figure out the best paths if there was a tsunami coming or hurricane coming, what might be best evacuation paths.
I just wanted to add that I had a PhD student who wrote a thesis, a dissertation about gamification. And one of the things he says is that these games like Pokemon Go, they're like the third generation location-based games, because the first generation, they were like experiments, very small scale. They wouldn't even collect data. Second generation, they started being commercial, things like Foursquare, but they were still kind of small scale. And then third generation, they're kind of this massively multiplayer games in which there are millions of players, and one of the main goals of the game is not the game itself, but it's actually data collection, right? So the data that's been collected with Pokemon, it's not just Pokemon. I mean, all this that buzz about gamification, I mean, it's kind of transforming ordinary life activities and fun activities, so that whenever you go to a store, you buy something and that information goes to databases. You walk around, where are the normal places you walk on your daily life, that goes to databases. Who do you interact with? How many, yeah, as Renee said, how much do you walk? How much do you stop? What do you buy? And I'm not sure in Pokemon Go specifically where this data goes, but I think the logics of big data is that data is being collected about us every time you open your phone, and it's going somewhere and it's being commodified in a way that it can be used for all sorts of different purposes, right? Mostly commercial, but so.
Great, so we're actually just at the end of our time for this webinar. Since we have a couple more questions posed in our chat, we're just going to take a few extra minutes, and I wanted to call the speakers' attention to a question that was posed by Rob Fike. So in particular, he's asking about the possible downsides of Pokemon Go and other similar augmented reality programs and games. But on the bright side of things, he asks, are there promising use cases we could see for augmented reality and personalized geographies that might be helpful for reducing some of the inequities that I believe he's referring to, Renee, your presentation where you talked about race, class, and gender. So perhaps we can get thoughts on that question from our speakers as well. Maybe we'll close with that question.
I think there is a benefit in, okay, let's say that a minority population created a game. Let's say we took it out of the hands of white programmers and we put it in the hands of the minority populations. It might be really interesting and a way for empowerment and a way for deepening one's connection to difference in space if they created it and they told us what they valued and how they viewed space. So let's have an augmented reality. What is it like being a Black man or a Black woman walking in space-time? Might be a useful function. In the same way that people often, there was a time in which people were donning fat suits like celebrities, and it's like, this is what it's like if I'm, if there's all this fat shaming going on, what it's like to walk around and be viewed and have that power taken away from you.
I think, oh, go ahead, Nick, go.
Oh, I was just going to say that Renee pointed to, I think, exactly the thing that I was going to compare to, which was actually the fat suit empathy thing. So there's a lot of interesting disability studies writing about those, which I think is useful in this case, which is that we all need to remember that even if we move some of the content of this around, the technology is sort of embedded within the social context, and less so the other way around, such that whatever these technologies are going to be they're going to happen within this broader context where inequalities exist. And so I think it would be hard to say that you could use an AR game, Pokemon Go in particular, or anything more generally to sort of make it just work like that. And the disability studies critique of the fat suit things is precisely that you can take the fat suit off at the end of the day, and that the system that you're working in where you have the fat suit on doesn't change. And so you have a feeling of empathy, but you don't really understand what it's like to sort of operate when you're actually, your whole sort of horizon of your world is determined in this system. And so I can imagine that there can be interesting ways of engaging with these kinds of systems to try to draw attention to that, to draw attention to those boundaries. But I would be doubtful that they would happen.
I think that in Canada, where we're just beginning to start to have a conversation about reconciliation with Indigenous communities of people, when I think about land recognition, for example, at Ryerson, we begin every public ceremony with the recognition that we're on ceded territory. If Indigenous communities of people chose to tell their stories using augmented reality, it could be quite potent. I think the key is who's initiating the story and what's the politics behind the narrative. A bunch of well-intentioned white folks in downtown Toronto doing it isn't going to be the same as if other communities of people are seizing the technology as a tool of assertion and activism. But really the authorship of the narrative is for me the fundamental piece in that regard. So Rob, your question's really good, but part of it depends on who's initiating it and what's their goal by using it. It needs to come from within, not be imposed upon, I think, for it to be transformative.
Yeah, and to add to Nick's point, the minority populations always feel that the majority population puts it upon them to create the education. So there's a downside to having endogenous Indigenous voices, for example. We shouldn't always say, you need to teach us what it's like to function in that space. So it behooves us to, talk amongst ourselves, we being all white and just saying, this is what it's like operating in space, and this is what we need to be sensitive to.
I just wanted to add a quick example that's not augmented reality, but there was a project done in the slums in Rio called Wikimapas, which basically, as we know, Google Maps would map the city, but the slums, they were like empty spaces. They were like almost as big cities, millions of people living in them, but you could not see streets or anything, as if they were like literally known places. And this project would get, Google Maps and get the people in the community to actually add information about these slums and map this slum space so that other people could access and navigate that space. So this, I think, it's an interesting use of location-based information, and it could be done in an augmented reality setting to kind of include people who are normally excluded from literally the map of the city.
And we didn't even talk about intellectual property issues. So one of the big challenges in the favelas and other places that Google sought to map was under the Google Map Maker program, Google explicitly owned that data. It's something to think about.
So unless there are any final points from any of our panelists, in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela, our convener, to give us her final remarks. I first wanted to thank all of our panelists for their, I think we all can agree, very unique and very interesting presentations. They were all quite different from each other and very interesting. I also wanted to thank all of our attendees for joining us for this first inaugural Geothink and Learn. We're really excited that you could be here with us. And now, without further ado, I'll let Pamela Robinson wrap up our session.
Yeah, I'll just make two pitches as we close this off and add my thanks. I'll say that, this little panel is a really good example of the power of interdisciplinary work. I learned many new things from people on this panel, and it was nice to see some new people and nice to hear people like Tennille, who I've known a long time, reflect on their research. But I also want to say that there's a benefit. This tool was popular a year ago. And now that we've had a bit of time to think and reflect, we're really starting to be able to tease out some of the implications. We'll see this technology come back, but having a little bit of space between its initial popularity and what's coming next has allowed people like us, I think, to ask some really good critical questions. So hopefully the panelists found it interesting. I certainly got a lot out of it. And thanks to the team at Geothink for organizing this and making it our inaugural Geothink and Learn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.